can we pause? Can we listen? And can we ask a curious question rather than, filling in the gap ourselves or assuming we know the solution or the answer? Being a bit more curious as we go about our work, I think, is also an incredibly useful habit in terms of driving innovation.
Welcome to The Fearless Foodie, the podcast that gets honest about what it really takes to thrive in food and retail. I'm Amy Wilkinson, coach, speaker and trusted partner to food industry teams with lived experience of the pace, pressure and politics that come with the job. Fearless Foodies cut through the fluff and get straight to what actually helps. And that's exactly what we're here to do. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Fearless Foodie. Today I'm joined by Nell Masey O'Neill, executive coach, former innovation director in the agri-food sector, and one of our brilliant Fearless Foodies coaches. We talk a lot about innovation in food, but what does it really mean? And what does it actually take culturally, commercially and behaviourally to make true innovation land rather than get stuck in kind of flavour tweaks and the whole firefighting that we see? That's what we're digging into today. Welcome now.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy. It's great to be here to chat to you. It's my, favourite topic.
Very good. And it's funny, isn't it? Because we've had a couple of weeks where we've not seen each other for months, and then we saw each other last week, and then we're running some training together tomorrow. So there's lots going on. So listeners may not know who you are. So just give us a bit of a background of who you are, how you came to work in innovation. I know we could do a whole episode on your career because it's amazing, but just give us a bit of a snapshot to start with.
Oh, thanks, Amy. Yeah. So my background is as a nutritional biochemist. So I trained at the University of Nottingham and with a broad background in nutrition and human nutrition, and then later specialising in animals, which led me to a doctorate in poultry nutrition, which might seem a bit distant from some of your fearless foodies. But actually, I think feeding chickens and producing chickens is clearly quite an important part of our food system. And nutrition principles are nutrition principles. So I then did some postdoctoral research, again, staying on at Nottingham, and then had some early bit of my career teaching. I then joined AB Agri, which is the agriculture part of Associated British Food, and spent quite a long time in that business, nearly 14 years, in various technical roles, research roles, and eventually leading the innovation function for that business. I think kind of the last point to say is, although I'm a scientist at heart and I'm passionate about our food systems, I'm also really, really interested in how people contribute to successful innovation outcomes. So how scientists who are often part of innovation teams, how they show up as leaders and how they develop their skills into leadership, but also how, people skills in general, leadership skills, help us to drive innovation forward. So that's how I've got into the executive coaching space.
Yeah. And I love the posts you do on LinkedIn and stuff. So anybody listening, if you don't already follow Nell, go and follow her, because it's that sweet spot between having technical knowledge and understanding. You can have all of that in the world, but if you are not able to influence people or have the right conversations or translate it into a language that everybody's going to get, then the innovation doesn't land. Like, it's kind of, you need both. You can't just be really clever, which you are now, just saying. But
thank you, Amy. That's not you.
Yeah. So let's talk about innovation, because I think this is one of those things, isn't it, where it's a term that gets bandied about a bit, and I get on a bit of a high horse about it, because people all talk about innovation, and in the world that I've worked in the most, in food manufacturing, they'll be calling it innovation, and it's literally like coming up with a new flavour. That isn't innovation, right? So talk to the listener about what innovation really is, or what your definition is.
Yeah, and I think I've had to learn that as I've gone through my career as well, Amy. I've had to learn and come up a bit with my own definition and understand what businesses think innovation is as well. So I think I tend to think of it as being two things, and you have to have both of these things for it to be innovation. The first one is novelty and something new. And then the second aspect is that has application. So, if you have just something new and novel, is that innovation? Well, potentially that's just an invention. So if you're a scientist or an inventor and you've invented something, but nobody wants to use it, has no utility, it's possibly not innovation. Equally, one of the things that we often confuse in business is R&D and innovation. And R&D, research and development, is often a key part of delivering innovation. But on its own, generating knowledge, generating new science is not necessarily innovation unless it has application.
Mm,
So I think it's those two things for me. It's something new, something novel that has an application.
yeah. Well, it's almost like you can come up with all the ideas you want, but if it's not actually fixing a real consumer problem, it's not innovation. It's just
Yeah,
being busy and making things look.
yeah, having an idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And ideas and creativity are super important, right? Those are important parts of the process. I think the other thing that is really worth pointing out as well is that innovation is not just product. Because I think in my world, in agriculture and agri-food, but also in food, pure sort of food disciplines, we think of product a lot. We think about physical product on a shelf, don't we?
Hmm.
But innovation isn't just that. So innovation can also be things like, how we bring value to a customer. So our business model. So there are lots of companies out there who are innovating in that space. So they're going from perhaps manufacturing and producing product to serving customers in a different way. So with services, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
And so that counts as innovation as well. That is something new serving a customer. So it doesn't just have to be product, although I think often that's what we mean in our sort of foodie context.
Yeah. And I think people often think about the product itself or, like I was saying, like new variants of the product and stuff. But one of the things that I see a lot of around where the true innovation are where it does things like extends the shelf life of the product as well. And do you know what I mean? It's not necessarily coming up with a different purpose for the end user. It's actually solving another problem like the shelf life or something like that.
Absolutely. So improving a process. And, that could have value, like you say, for the customer, improving shelf life, for example, or it could have value for the company itself. So many people will be innovating to improve efficiency in their production. That's also innovation, I think. I think, there's another lens which we've also used, in a role where I was innovation director, where we categorized innovation. And I wonder if that's quite a useful, way to look at it. And we thought about it in different tiers. So these are terms that we sort of borrowed from elsewhere, but developed to our own purpose. But we thought about sort of one tier being operational innovation.
Hmm.
So that's the kind of thing which is completely within scope of your existing business and is things like improving your existing products. So making them better, as you've said, talking about flavor, for example.
Hmm.
The second tier is maybe pushing that scope a little bit. We called that tactical innovation.
Hmm.
And tactical innovation is more about sort of extending product lines, for example. How
Yeah.
can you start to push yourself out of scope, but it's something that you don't already do perhaps in quite the same way. And then the third level that we had was strategic innovation, and that is more game changing. So
Hmm.
the kind of product or project that might change the industry, might change your business for the future. So, for example, might be something like there's a lot of talk for alternative protein. So if you're a company that has focused on meat-based products and is starting to move towards perhaps very novel protein sources that are vegetarian, for example, that's quite game changing. So that's what we would have called a sort of strategic level. It's
Hmm.
out of the scope of existing business.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, it'd be good to get your view on it, but I think in my experience, a lot of time is spent at those first two levels, like very tactical, very short-termist, not really thinking that far ahead, because the next level up sometimes feels a bit too hard, or it's hard to quantify what the results are going to be of that.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. And I think in my experience, I've quite often said the strategic stuff goes in the hard box, right? And
Mm.
it's hard because it needs expertise that perhaps you don't already have in your business, or it's hard because it's longer term. And therefore, we have to have a bit of a vision for that. We have to have a bit of patience. We have to have some courage for that because it's longer term. Yeah. So I would definitely say in that hard box and requires perhaps more focus from the whole business. So requires a bit more cross-functional working,
Yeah, yeah.
buy-in from a bigger set of people.
Yeah, which in itself is more difficult. So it's not even that the technology or the skills or whatever, it's actually, it just becomes more cumbersome because more people have to get involved.
Absolutely.
And do you think that's what holds businesses back, or do you think there's other things that hold businesses back from like properly, truly innovating?
I mean, I think that being in the hard box and, requiring probably a business to change itself to a certain extent, I think.
Mm.
I think that's what makes it hard often. And I think often there are lots of stakeholders that have to be involved in big scale change like that. So, if you have shareholders, boards who are expecting short-term return on certain, on spend in year, for example, if you're expecting that quick return and changing a mindset to something that's going to be more long-term, that's quite significant change for lots of levels within a business. So I think, yes, I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why. And I think quite often these kind of very, very strategically innovative, game-changing things happen outside big business, actually, happen
Mm.
outside big business, perhaps in startups, spin-outs, that part of the innovation ecosystem, because there's no change that's required.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's starting from scratch. So I think quite a lot of it exists in that sort of sphere.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And you see that, don't you? And then big businesses come up and swallow up the startups. But that's part of, some startups are quite happy with that. They're making the return on investment by doing the innovation themselves, and then a bigger business taking over. But yeah, it's a really good point, actually, because I just think, if I think about startups I've worked with and stuff, that you can be a lot more agile. There tends to be less people, so therefore it's a lot easier to get stuff across the line. And people are more willing to take risks because there aren't as many shareholders, all of that.
And also, I think if you're in a startup environment, the sort of risky aspect of it is very explicit, isn't it? That's what you're signing up for.
Yeah.
And again, you're not changing an existing culture necessarily to make that happen.
Yeah. It's an interesting one because I'm like then thinking, well, did big businesses not need to innovate then? Well, we know that they do. So like, I guess that it comes on to what we were going to talk about really, like how do you get people on board to the facts? Because I know a lot of people that are listening will work in those, might work in an innovation function or MPD or R&D that are, closely linked with innovation. And they come up against this constant battle of, not having time to think about the strategic stuff, but also the will not being there for the strategic stuff. So I guess there's like a million things in there, but almost the questions are, why does it matter? And what are the conditions that you need to create to make it happen?
I mean, I'm interested in your take on this as well, Amy. I think innovation for, across our food systems or food ecosystems, I think is so important because of the big challenges that we have.
Mm.
And I think we are going to need to make radical, I was going to say strategic to use that word again, but we're going to need to make radical changes to the way that we do things, the way that we produce food. And if we keep doing things the way we've always done them, we're not going to find those solutions. So I think it is incredibly important that we find ways to build innovation into our ecosystem. So, maybe that's supporting the startup community, but also in big business, I think it's incredibly important. Yeah.
Yeah. So what stops it? Well, we've talked about what stops it, which is, a lot of there's politics, it's the aversion to risk, all of that sort of stuff. So how, you obviously worked in this space for quite a long time. Did you, I was going to say, did you just bang your head against a brick wall the whole time? Or
Yeah. I mean, there's a certain amount of that. One of the things that I have really noticed, which can be a blocker, and I suppose there's lots of different answers to this particular blocker, is one of control, I think. So I think in business, there's a lot of a need to control a lot of things, right? Process, and quite often in food, we are quite process oriented, and for lots of very, very good reasons. We're very interested in safety and that sort of thing. So we need process, but I think sometimes we're quite focused on those processes and the control that we have to have. And that's not just a comment about things, that's a comment, about lots of different industries and businesses. And I think control is quite incompatible with, game changing innovation, actually. So a really sort of generic example is finances. Sometimes innovation requires significant financial input, significant resources, and the need to control that spend and how that spend is made. And what that then does is give us sort of requirements to report spending and report, what we're doing with what money and where we're doing it. And that's understandable. But those kind of levels of control and that level of reporting that then comes on the top can really stifle creativity and idea generation, those things you were mentioning earlier. We need to come up with ideas. We need to be creative. We need to be agile, another word that you use. And if we're constantly being asked to report, that can be really quite limiting, I think. So I think, and this is perhaps a comment for leaders of teams who are looking for reporting, how can we find that balance between the information we need to share, the control we need to have over certain things, the reporting that we want to do as a result, and really moving forward in an agile way, trying to progress things forward. And that's not an easy thing. I don't think that's necessarily an easy thing to solve, but it's a thinking prompt, I think, to say how much control do we have in our systems, or are we building it to our system here?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. It's not necessarily when I worked in like the innovation space, but when I worked in insight, which obviously leads innovation, so data and insight, to inform decisions, I got so frustrated. I was put into that team as somebody who could think creatively and differently, managing a team of data people, which is maybe something we'll talk about as well in terms of those, the different brains that we all have and stuff. And we spent so much time worrying about reporting on what had happened in the last month, the last quarter, the last year, and not on the so what and what does that mean for us and the creative thinking part of it, that it was really, it was really frustrating. And it's like, I get that there's a need for it and it helps to inform decisions, but it comes back to that. It's almost like that's something solid and something we can measure, and like everybody feels safe in that space. But actually, is that what's going to drive the business forward?
Absolutely. And equally, if I'm controlling this thing, whether it's a project or some finances or whatever, if I'm controlling it, am I de-risking it? There's quite an interesting thought process that you can have off the back of that about risk. And if I'm trying to de-risk it, am I taking creativity out of it? And what does that say about my safety? If I'm trying to de-risk it, is it because I don't feel safe about the outcome of this project? And maybe, again, that's a good thinking prompt about safety. You just said it a second ago, Amy, about safety in teams. Is it okay to fail here? Because I can tell you what, if you're leading innovation or working in innovation, that's going to happen. It's going to happen quite often. And how do we do that and make it okay? Make it a learning opportunity, make it a discussion point, make it not judgmental to anybody. How do we make sure that's happening so people feel safe, can take risks, and therefore don't feel they need to control things? So it's kind of a bit circular, isn't it? There's lots of things in there that fit together. And I think there's a lot in there for leaders, people who lead teams, but there's also a bit in there for individuals. I think, and I recognize this in myself from earlier on in my career, I think particularly if you're scientifically trained, I want answers to this. There is a right answer. I want data and I want facts, and I can control this thing if I've got all those bits. So I can, trying to gather that to be in control and de-risk something.
Yeah.
So I think there's lots in there about control and safety and risk.
Yeah. And effectively what we're talking about, and I know I've talked about it on the podcast before in terms of teams and leadership and all of that, is it's how we create these conditions, and that psychological safety, which is that you can speak up and say what you think and not be afraid of the repercussions. So there's that element. What else do you think from the conditions, for people listening and thinking about, why is my business not innovative enough, or how do I help the teams to be more innovative? What are the things that make the difference, do you think? Feeling safe and that you can take a risk.
Yes. I mean, super important. I think those things are really incredibly important. I think collaboration is another one. And there's, I've been reading quite a bit about this recently, and there's lots said about that's what businesses want. That's what businesses feel they need, and that's what they want for innovation to move forward, is collaboration. And I think, again, having read a bit about this recently, I think there is a real difference between working alongside each other and truly collaborating with others. And I think that being able to collaborate is incredibly important. We were talking earlier about how innovation is really a whole business, particularly at sort of strategic levels, is a whole business endeavor, really. Everybody's probably, from supply chain to procurement to finance, everybody's got a part to play probably in big innovation. So collaborating together effectively and not just working on our own projects in our own teams is really, really important. And I think there's creating the conditions. There's lots about control and ownership in there, isn't there? And safety to work on other things with other people and not having to control your own outcome all of the time. So I think encouraging collaboration, encouraging cross-functional working. And I notice in the work that we do, Amy, that listening's really important in that, isn't it? Building listening skills, active listening. How can I listen to what this other person in this other function needs and wants out of this? How can we have a good conversation about how our priorities might be the same, might be slightly different, how our working styles might be the same or slightly different? So that's listening, encouraging conversation, making time for that, I think. I don't know if you notice this as well, working with teams, but sometimes that's really hard.
Oh, I think that's often the biggest thing, is actually people getting time together and proper quality time, like you say, where you're actually listening to one another, not just information being, barked at one another and everybody just waiting to speak rather than actively listening. All right, time to give a quick shout out to the people making this podcast happen. These are the brilliant sponsors backing bold, fearless conversations like this one. Let's hear from them. Ever chased a test result at 5:59 p.m. on a Friday? Yeah, we've been there too. That's why we're proud to be partnered with IFP Labs, a lab network that actually gets what it's like to work in food. They support businesses across Europe with accredited testing for food, feed, swabs, water and more. And they do it with a quick turnaround, expert insight and genuinely reliable service. IFP Labs is a laboratory network made up of companies who we know and trust because they're already supporting the people behind the products you love. Check them out at ifp-labs.com and breathe a little easier next time you've got a product launch riding on that test report. Want to build a high-performing team that doesn't shy away from the tough stuff? Our team coaching goes beyond away days. It creates the space for honest conversations, stronger collaboration and shared accountability. Especially powerful for stretch teams who need to reset, refocus and move forward together. Find out how it could work for your team at fearlessfoodies.co.uk. And we're back. Let's dive right in.
When I work with teams, that's one of the things that I hear really often is through periods of team coaching, learning to have these kinds of conversations. Exactly as you say, Amy, it's not a technical conversation about, the order in which we're going to do things. And here's our agenda and we need to talk about this project and then this project. Well, what about the ways in which we work together? This thing that we did last week where we all worked together, how did that go? How did we feel about it? Was it successful? What behaviors did we use that helped or hindered us? Those conversations I think are quite rare. So, but everybody can encourage that, can't they? That's something that people at all levels in a business can encourage, is those kind of good quality conversations. And it's not easy. It really isn't easy.
Yeah, it's really funny you say that, because I'm thinking about a session I had with a team recently. It's so uncommon for people to do that I was obviously asking coaching questions and asking about the behaviours and stuff like that. And they kept coming back to task, well, we did this and we achieved this and we did that. And I was like, yeah, but what behaviours how did you do it? It's not about what you did, it's about how you did it. Because actually that's where a lot of the innovation, like mindset comes from, isn't it? Like, actually, we were really open and honest with each other. And we said what we thought, but respectfully. And, oh, okay, yeah, we need to do that more, because they're the human bits, like the data science, the whatever is going to happen, but it's the human behaviours that's going to make it,
Absolutely. And I think one of the key behaviours that individuals can do and then encourage in teams is really being reflective as an individual. And, when I've worked with teams, sharing a model of reflection, and there are lots of them about, where you spend 5 minutes just yourself thinking about this thing I did today, whether it was good or bad or whatever. How did I feel about it? What behaviors was I displaying, and just trying to notice things. And I think if you can do that as an individual and interrogate and be curious about the things that are happening, you can start to share that within a team,
Yeah.
can't you? And say, oh, or maybe with a close colleague, and then expand that out into a team. And I think building those reflective behaviors are super important for innovation altogether. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost that giving yourself the time to self-reflect and think about what works for you, but actually, well, it's twofold, isn't it? Sharing that with other people helps people understand you better, therefore you work better together, but it also gives people permission. If you're a leader listening, what is the best way to get people to feel more psychologically safe and open up more? It's to demonstrate and model that behavior, isn't it? It's not to say, it's absolutely fine if you fail, and then pretend that you've never failed at anything in your life ever,
Exactly. And I think, one of the things that is really fantastic is getting those learnings out onto the table. So,
Mm,
leaders can model, oh, this thing happened to me the other day and it didn't turn out the way I hoped it was going to turn out. And I think that was because I da, da, da. If you can be, and it takes courage, but if you can be courageous, exactly as you say, and model those kind of, it's okay for things not to go right all the time. Let's talk about it. Let's learn. Where's the learning? And I think that's the really important thing about reflection, is working out where the learning is, because otherwise it
yeah.
just becomes, getting down in the dumps about that thing that happened, or let me,
Mm,
really, where's the learning? Okay, well, let's move forward from it.
yeah.
And I think brilliant skill as a team and an individual.
Yeah. And even like that same giving that moment of reflection, like you say, it's not about getting into a self-deprecation spiral of like, oh, and then I did this wrong and then I did that wrong. It's like, it's actually that reframe, isn't it? Of for every mistake that is made, there is a learning. And actually, if I can, I used to hate it when people were like, oh, every cloud has a silver lining. It's not that bad things don't happen, but actually being able to work out what the lesson in it is softens the blow of it as well, like personally, as well as helps the innovation process.
And, I think we think of food, don't we? And we've all been in it as being quite high stakes and quite fast moving.
Mm,
And, can we do this? Have we got time to do this? We've not got time to fail on these things. And,
yeah.
there's too much at stake here. But it's interesting to reflect as well that most of the research on psychological safety comes from medicine.
Mm,
A lot of that is talking about how doctors and nurses perform. And that's high stakes too, and I think there's lots of suggestion that when those types of professions can be reflective, it improves outcomes.
yeah.
So that's what we're aiming for, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. If you think about the parallel, you want your surgeon to, if something goes wrong, you want them to reflect and learn from that, so they're not doing it to the next person. But it's got to be encouraged, hasn't it? And I think we're often so quick to just move on to the, oh, well, that didn't work, and move on to the next thing. It's one of the things I harp on about a lot of the time is like post-launch review process, and making sure that you do reflect back, even if it is about how the project ran and how we worked together. You are going to learn something from it, even if the product failed. So like, don't skip that step. But I think, like you say, because of the fast pace, people are often just like, what's the next thing I can do? What's the next task I can tick off the list? Because somehow that feels more productive than, stepping back and looking back.
Absolutely. And I think it's also good for our mental health as well, isn't it? To reflect and close something. Because if we don't close these things, and I think we're thinking particularly when things don't go the way we hope, if we don't close them properly, then they sort of fester a bit and sit, or
Mm,
potentially they sit there and they fester a bit. And, reflection can also have that benefit of, closing the thing and
yeah.
moving forward.
Well, and being clear on it as well, because I'm thinking, because then what happens, and this is probably not in true innovation, I'm probably thinking in MPD terms here now, or R&D, but you then, 3-5 years later, somebody comes up with the same idea and everybody's like, oh, well, it didn't work last time. But because you've not closed the loop properly, you don't actually understand the why it didn't work, and got the learning from it. So there is something in that closing the loop bit, isn't there, for that?
Yeah. And I think, you talk about true innovation, Amy, but I think, I described earlier sort of levels of innovation or different types of innovation. And I think probably these skills that we're talking about, you probably need them to differing extents for all of those. So whatever the kind of, whether it's MPD, whether it's a slightly more, product line extension, or whether it really is something that's going to change the way the business functions. These skills are all going to be useful. And I think, if we think about that example you gave earlier about a product that perhaps has a new flavor or a new variant to it, if you're wanting to push that maybe to a sort of slightly different level of innovation, exhibiting some of these skills is perhaps, or demonstrating rather, some of these skills is perhaps going to enable people to just push that a little bit more. So I think if you're trying to move from one to the other, if that's an objective, then, modeling these skills is important and helpful.
Yeah, yeah. I know this is all really useful discussions that we're having here, but I want to get to what are like actionable things that people can take away from this podcast episode. So I'm not going to quick fire you, don't worry now. I just want to get to some because I think the discussion, I know this episode's going to be really helpful for so many people that are in the Fearless Foodies world. And even the validation of the conversation we're having will be helpful, but some practical tips on what people can do to, make a real difference in their businesses. So if you had to pick something that, every business should be applying to make innovation happen, what would you make that thing?
I think it really is kind of a summary of some of the things we've been talking about, Amy.
Yeah.
I think trying to encourage safety and comfort with failure are some of the most important things. And I think, so how can we do that reflective piece ourselves? We're starting to build that muscle, aren't we, of understanding that it's okay to fail and we can move forward, and then building that into teams. So I think businesses who can encourage those good quality conversations, making time for that, how do we close this project, learn from it and move forward, and helping leaders to model those kind of behaviors, because it isn't easy. I mean, we've talked about it. It's something that we think about quite often, and we've talked about it, but it's not always easy. So how can we encourage and help people with the skills that they need to do that?
Yeah, and I think there's two things. Like, obviously, I always have my business hat on in the background now, and there's things that we do in terms of Fearless Foodies, in terms of training and coaching around those sorts of skill sets, like how do you make it safe? How do you have those difficult conversations? All of those bits that sometimes don't come naturally to people. And particularly if, like you were saying, if you've got more scientific brain, it doesn't necessarily come naturally to you. So there's options there, isn't it, there to get support in to help people develop those skills. But there's almost that bit. And then there's the modeling, on a human level, it's modeling those behaviours yourself. And that I actually see can be quite a disconnect sometimes. I often have leaders come to me and say, we need training for the team because they're not having the difficult conversations. They're not doing X, Y, and Z. And they're not, and then when it comes to it, we get into a conversation. It's like, are you doing those things? Because if you're expecting your team to do them, you have to be able to do them yourself. So there's almost that reflection piece is helpful to look in the mirror and go, am I acting in a way that creates those conditions for everybody? Because it's not do as I say, it's people do as they see you doing, don't they?
Yeah. And I think, it's all tied together. You have to be quite bold, I think, to do that. And sometimes it requires courage and being bold to stand up to stakeholders above you as well as a leader to say, hang on a minute, we can't add this extra thing in because we're all so busy. We need to stop and pause to look at this last bit before we move on to this next thing. And it takes courage, and bold and big bold.
And I think that's a really good point because we know that teams are so stretched the whole time. If I look back, if you see it in the parts of the food industry you've worked in as well, but if I look back 20, 25 years, the resources are a lot tighter and margins are a lot tighter than they were back then. So actually everybody is a little bit more stretched. So I guess there's something, isn't there, in that don't feel like you've got to do massive things, like these little tiny bits of behavioural change do actually make a difference over time.
And I think, if you've got colleagues that you trust around you, and I hope lots of your listeners have, practicing some of these behaviours with your colleagues around you. So one thing we did once in a team where I was working was agree to practice feedback with each other. Mm-hmm. So we sat in a team meeting and said, we know feedback's important for safety in the team. So can we agree between us that we'll practice, give each other permission to practice this? So if somebody offers to give you some feedback, listen to them, take on board what they're saying, and just you practice that habit of doing that, giving and also seeking feedback. And I think if you've got colleagues around you that you trust, those small habits of practicing those things start to snowball after a while, don't they?
Yeah, yeah. So is there anything else now that you feel like listeners need to hear from you about how to make innovation land before we say goodbye to them? Because I feel like there must be.
I think we've talked a lot about sort of interpersonal skills, really, haven't we?
Yeah.
And how to build teams and how to work effectively together and make time to talk about that. I think probably another really good tip that we haven't really touched on, but I think will sound familiar to people, is about how we communicate our ideas. I think that's probably another kind of quite key point that comes up, is how are we sharing our ideas with people? Are we doing that with clarity? Are we doing that with good? You talked about marketing earlier. Have we got good insights, good market insights that tell us about the direction? Have we used that? Have we used the evidence that we've got to share good messages, useful messages with people? So I think that's the one, that kind of perhaps more of a technical skill, I think, that's very helpful with innovation, is being able to communicate our ideas.
Yeah, and that, I think that can be a place where things fall down a little bit, isn't it? Because actually you can have the best ideas in the world, and it could have come out of that insight, and it could be fixing a real world problem. But if you can't say it in a way that the business, the customer, or the end consumer gets, then it's innovation lost. And then I guess it still kind of meets your two pillars of it. It's there for a need, and it's truly new, but it's not necessarily therefore then it's successful because people don't get it.
Yeah. And again, you talked about training earlier and getting help. There's help for those kind of things. If coaching, various types of training, practice, there's help for that. And if we can get really, really sharp at communicating messages, I think that's another useful one to add.
Yeah. Which segues quite nicely into me saying we do training in this sort of area. Although this, just to say that this episode was not about selling that, but I think it would be remiss not to mention it, because we're doing communication skills workshop tomorrow, aren't we, with the MPD team? It's I think sometimes, like people listening, sometimes when you're a leader, or even if you're in a team and you can sort of see that there's the gap and there's the disconnect, and you want to do something about it, but you're too busy firefighting and getting the day job done, right? Aren't you? So that you don't have time to think about these things.
Absolutely. And I think another one has just popped into my head as you've been talking there, which I think we've kind of touched on a little bit, but is also super key to innovation and driving innovation with teams. And that's listening and curiosity and questioning. And I know we think about that a lot. I can't believe we haven't talked about this in a bit more detail already. But I think that's another habit that individuals can develop and can kind of develop that muscle a little bit. It's just pausing to listen to either I think we try to get good at listening to customers, but listening to customers, listening to colleagues, listening to the marketplace in general. Can we pause? Can we listen? And can we ask a curious question rather than filling in the gap ourselves or assuming we know the solution or the answer? Being a bit more curious as we go about our work, I think, is also an incredibly useful habit in terms of driving innovation. So, the classic one, I think in science, this is quite common as well. Jumping to solutions mode. Well, hang on. Can we just stop and think maybe there are 5 different solutions? Oh, what are those 5 different solutions? Oh, how do we all feel about those 5 solutions? Can we critique them a little bit? That curiosity, that listening, I think, is also another useful thing we can practice.
Yeah. And it's something obviously we get trained in as coaches. And I think I thought I was good at it before and then when you get coach training, you're like, oh no, it turns out that a lot of the time I thought I was listening, but I was actually thinking about how I was going to respond. Whereas actually it is a real skill set to have that curiosity and listen and still be thinking about what you're going to say next. And it's a muscle that you do have to train. And we do hundreds of hours, don't we, to get that muscle going.
But I think that's really interesting, isn't it? About that switch as well as, do I actually need to have a response? So I could be thinking about what my response is. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe the thing that I need to do here is just consider what the other person has said quite deeply.
Yeah.
and go away and think about it. So I think, yeah, that's another key one, Amy, the
Yeah.
sort of listening and curiosity.
Yeah. I feel like we've probably got another podcast in us now. You're going to have to come back in another
I love
series to
talking
talk about that. But this has been a really interesting chat. I know lots of people are going to have taken a lot from it, genuinely. I don't know why I felt I need to say genuinely there, like I was going to be lying. Why would I? So what is the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to now to continue the conversation?
Well, I'm incredibly proud to be a fearless foodie. So via you, Amy, I'm sure is, you can always contact me and our other colleagues via you. I try to post quite a lot on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most present, I suppose, in terms of social media. I try to post things which people will find interesting and thought-provoking, I think, is what I try to do with LinkedIn, and very, very happy to connect with people there.
Yeah, so definitely go and connect with Nell on LinkedIn if you're listening. She does these great videos and always so like calm, so not like me. Like I'm like, and yours are so calm and considered. I love it. And I always get something from one of your videos. So thank you. And thank you for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Lovely talking to you, Amy. And it's great to sort of, have a conversation about it and chat about our shared experiences a bit. So it's great.
Thank you, Nell, for such a thoughtful and practical conversation. And for everyone else, stay with me for a moment because I want to pull out a few key takeaways before we wrap up. If there's one thing this conversation shows, it's that innovation isn't just about having clever ideas or new products. It's about the conditions we create for people to think differently, for them to take risks, to collaborate and to learn. 3 things I hope you take away from today. First one, psychological safety is the foundation. If people are scared to fail, they'll stay in the same safe lane, and the safe lane never really delivers innovation. The second one, collaboration means genuinely listening to each other and shared ownership, not just working in parallel, working in those silos. And the third one is that pause and that reflection matters. So closing the loop on what worked and what didn't, and I talk about this all the time, we're rubbish at doing post-launch reviews, and not making it not just about the actual project, but thinking about how you behaved as a team, because that really helps to the whole team to grow braver and bolder over this time. If this episode sparked something for you, or you know a team who needs this conversation, please rate and review the podcast and share it with your work bestie as always. And also come and talk to me at Fearless Foodies about how we help your teams to feel safer, to be braver, and to drive that innovation. And thanks again to Nell for such a thoughtful chat. And thank you for listening. Be bold, be brave, be fearless. That's a wrap on this episode of The Fearless Foodie. If it hit home, subscribe, leave a review and share it with someone who's ready for less fluff and more real talk. And if you're ready to build a bolder, braver, more brilliant team, come find me at fearlessfoodies.co.uk. Until next time, be bold, be brave, be fearless.